The smoke rose over the eastern ridge like the devil's own breath, thick and black against the August sky, and Grace Whitmore knew before anyone else told her that everything she had left in this world was about to burn. She stood on the porch of her small ranch house, shading her eyes against the brutal afternoon sun that beat down on the New Mexico Territory Valley. The year was 1881, and the drought had turned everything brown and brittle. 3 months without decent rain had left the grasslands looking like kindling, and now somewhere beyond those ridges, a wildfire was coming their way. Grace could smell it on the wind, that acrid scent of burning pinon and juniper, mixing with the dust that never seemed to settle anymore. Her father had died 6 months ago, leaving her this struggling cattle ranch just outside of Lincoln. At 23 years old, Grace had fought to keep the place running, fought against the men who told her to sell, fought against the elements that seemed determined to drive her off the land. She had 2 ranch hands left, both old enough to be her grandfather, and a herd of 40 cattle that were getting thinner by the week. The ranch was small, barely profitable even in good years, but it was hers. It was all she had. Now it was going to burn. Grace heard hoofbeats behind her and turned to see Miguel, her oldest hand, riding in fast from the eastern pasture. His weathered face was grim, his usually calm demeanor replaced by something close to panic. "Miss Whitmore," he called out as he reined in his horse, "that fire is moving fast. Real fast. The wind is pushing it straight toward the valley. Sheriff says everyone needs to evacuate by nightfall." Grace felt her stomach drop. How far out is it? Maybe 10 miles, but with this wind and how dry everything is, it will be here by tomorrow morning. "We need to load up what we can and head into town." She looked past him toward the eastern ridge, where the smoke was growing thicker by the minute, billowing up into massive columns that darkened the sky. 10 miles. That was all that stood between her and losing everything. What about the cattle? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Miguel's expression softened with sympathy. "We can try to drive them ahead of the fire, but in this heat, with how weak they already are, most would not make it. I am sorry, Miss Whitmore. I truly am." Grace turned back to look at her house. It was not much, just a simple wooden structure her father had built with his own hands 20 years ago when he first claimed this land. The barn behind it leaned slightly to the left, and the fences needed mending in a dozen places, but it was home. Inside were her mother's quilts, her father's books, the photographs of better times. Outside was the land her family had bled and sweated over, the earth that held her parents' dreams even if it no longer held their bodies. "Tell Hector to start loading the wagon," she said quietly. "We will take what we can fit, but I want to wait as long as possible." Miguel looked like he wanted to argue but simply nodded and rode off toward the bunkhouse. Grace stood on the porch a moment longer, watching the smoke, feeling the hot wind against her face. She refused to cry. She had cried herself empty when her father died, and tears would not save her home now. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of frantic activity. Grace packed her most precious belongings, the things that could never be replaced. Her mother's wedding dress, carefully folded in tissue paper. The family Bible with all the birth and death dates inscribed in faded ink. Her father's rifle, the one he had carried during the war. Photographs, letters, her mother's jewelry box. It all seemed so pitifully small when reduced to what could fit in a single trunk. The sun was sinking toward the western mountains when Grace heard another horse approaching. She stepped out of the house, wiping sweat from her forehead, and saw a rider coming up the path from the main road. Even from a distance, she could tell this was not one of her neighbors. The man sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone who spent more time in the saddle than out of it, and he was leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. As he drew closer, Grace found herself staring. The man was massive, built like the mountains themselves, with broad shoulders and arms that strained against his worn cotton shirt. His hair was dark brown and hung past his shoulders, pulled back from his face with a leather cord. Several days' worth of beard shadowed his jaw, and his skin was deeply tanned from constant exposure to the elements. He looked to be in his late 20s, maybe 30 at most, with striking blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He reined in his horse a respectful distance from the porch and touched the brim of his hat. "Madam, name is Vincent Yates. I have been tracking through the high country and saw the smoke. Came down to see if folks needed help." His voice was deep and quiet, with the slight rough edge of someone not used to speaking much. Grace noticed the way he held himself, alert but not threatening, and the well-worn gear that marked him as someone who lived off the land. A mountain man, then. She had heard of them, the solitary trappers and hunters who spent months at a time in the wilderness. But she had never met one before. "Grace Whitmore," she replied. "I appreciate the offer, but unless you can make it rain or turn back a wildfire, I do not think there is much anyone can do." "We are evacuating." Vincent's gaze moved past her to the house, then out across the valley to the advancing smoke. His expression was thoughtful, calculating. "How much time do you figure you have? Sheriff says the fire will be here by morning." He is probably right, given how the wind is blowing. Vincent dismounted in one smooth motion and stood looking at the landscape with the same intense focus Grace had seen hawks use when hunting. But there might be another option. Grace felt a flicker of something she was afraid to name. Hope was dangerous. "What do you mean?" Vincent walked to the edge of the porch and pointed toward the eastern ridge. "Fire is coming from that direction, pushed by the wind." But if someone was to create a firebreak, a wide enough strip of cleared land between here and there, the fire would not have fuel to cross it. It would burn itself out or move around the valley. "A firebreak," Grace repeated. "How wide would it need to be?" "Depends on how hot the fire is burning and how strong the wind gets. But I would say at least 100 feet, maybe more to be safe. Clear everything down to bare earth. It is hard work, and it needs to be done fast." Grace looked at the distance between her ranch and the ridge. "It had to be at least 2 miles. That is impossible. We do not have enough men or time. You have me." The simple statement hung in the air between them. Grace studied the mountain man's face, looking for any sign of false bravado or foolishness, but she saw only calm certainty. This was a man who was used to facing impossible odds and finding a way through. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "You do not know me. This is not your land." Vincent was quiet for a moment, and Grace saw something shift in his expression, something almost vulnerable beneath the hard competence. "I know what it is like to lose everything," he said finally. "If there is a chance to save your home, seems worth taking it." Miguel and Hector had come out of the barn and were watching the exchange with obvious curiosity. Grace looked at them, then back at Vincent, then at her house. The logical choice was to leave, to take what she could and accept the loss. But Grace had spent the last 6 months fighting against logic, refusing to accept what everyone told her was inevitable. "What would you need?" she asked. Vincent's eyes met hers, and she saw approval there, a recognition of shared stubbornness. "Every able body you have got, every shovel, pick, and axe, and you will need to trust me to direct the work because we will not have time for discussion once we start." "Miguel, Hector," Grace called. "Come here." She introduced the ranch hands to Vincent and explained his plan. Miguel looked skeptical, and Hector openly doubtful, but both men had known Grace her whole life and knew better than to argue when she had made up her mind. "We will need to scout the best location for the break," Vincent said. already moving toward his horse. "Miguel, you know this land. Show me where the fire is most likely to come through." They spent the next hour riding the eastern boundary of the ranch while Vincent evaluated the terrain. Grace rode with them, watching the way the mountain man read the land like she might read a book, noting the natural barriers and weak points, the way the wind moved through the draws and over the ridges. He finally settled on a location where the valley narrowed slightly, creating a natural bottleneck. "Here," he said, dismounting. "We clear from that outcropping to that dry creek bed. It is the narrowest point, which means less work, but it still gives us width enough to stop the fire if we dig it deep and wide." Grace looked at the distance he indicated. Even at the narrow point, it had to be 300 yards across. "When do we start?" "Right now. We work through the night and tomorrow. The fire will not wait for us to be ready." They rode back to the ranch and gathered every tool that could cut, dig, or scrape. Grace sent Hector into Lincoln to recruit any men willing to help, though she was not optimistic about the response. Her neighbors had their own properties to worry about, and many of them had made it clear they thought a woman had no business trying to run a ranch anyway. While they waited to see if reinforcements would come, Vincent began marking out the firebreak with stakes and rope, creating clear boundaries for the work ahead. Grace watched him move with efficient purpose, no wasted motion, no hesitation. There was something almost graceful about it despite his size, like watching a predator in its element. "You have done this before," she said. It was not a question. Vincent paused in his work and looked at her. "Fought fires?" "Yes. Lost my family's homestead to one when I was 16. That is when I headed up into the mountains. Seemed safer to live where there was nothing left to lose." The raw honesty in his voice struck something deep in Grace's chest. "I am sorry. I lost my father 6 months back. My mother died when I was 12. I know what it is like to be alone." "Then you know why this matters," Vincent said simply. He handed her a shovel. "Can you dig?" Grace took the tool and felt the weight of it in her hands. She had spent the last 6 months proving she could do ranch work, that she was strong enough to survive in a man's world. "I can dig." "Good. We are going to need every hand we can get." Hector returned from town an hour later with disappointing news. Most folks were busy protecting their own property or had already evacuated. But he had managed to recruit 3 men: a blacksmith named Tom, a bartender named Eddie, and a drifter looking for work named Charlie. It was not much, but it was better than nothing. As the sun set, 7 people stood at the edge of what would become the firebreak. Vincent gathered them together and laid out the plan in clear, concise terms. They would work in shifts, some digging while others cleared brush and hauled it away. The goal was to create a strip of bare earth wide enough and deep enough that no spark or ember could cross it. It would be exhausting, brutal work, especially in the heat, but it was their only chance. "One more thing," Vincent said, his gaze sweeping across the group. "The fire is unpredictable. If the wind shifts, if it moves faster than we expect, I will tell you to run. When I say run, you drop everything and go. No arguments, no looking back." "Understood." Everyone nodded, and Grace felt a chill despite the heat. This was real. They were gambling their lives on the chance they could outwork a wildfire. They began as twilight fell, and within an hour, Grace understood the true meaning of exhaustion. She had thought she knew hard work from running the ranch, but this was different. This was swinging a pick until her shoulders screamed, digging until her hands bled through the work gloves, hauling rocks and debris until her legs shook with fatigue. The night air was hot and thick with smoke, making every breath an effort, and the glow from the advancing fire painted the eastern sky an ominous orange. Vincent worked like a machine, setting a pace that should have been impossible to maintain but somehow never flagging. He was everywhere at once, directing the work, helping when someone fell behind, making adjustments as they went. Grace found herself stealing glances at him, marveling at the sheer power in his movements as he swung an axe or lifted a boulder that should have required 2 men to move. Sweat soaked through his shirt, plastering it to his muscular back and chest, and his long hair came loose from its tie to hang around his face in wild tangles. Around midnight, Miguel called for a water break. Everyone collapsed where they stood, gasping and gulping from canteens. Grace sat on a pile of cleared brush, her whole body trembling with exhaustion. They had cleared maybe 50 yards, not even a sixth of what they needed. Vincent crouched beside her and offered his canteen. "Drink slow. Do not make yourself sick." Grace took it gratefully and let the lukewarm water soothe her parched throat. "How are we going to finish in time?" "One shovelful at a time," Vincent said. "Focus on the next foot, then the next. Do not think about the whole thing or it will crush you." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the same exhaustion in his face that she felt in her bones. But there was something else there too, a fierce determination that would not bend or break. "Why are you really doing this? You could have ridden right past. This is not your fight." Vincent was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the glowing horizon. "Maybe I got tired of running. Maybe I want to see what it is like to stand and fight for something again." He turned to look at her, and in the flickering light of their torches, his eyes were intense. "Maybe I saw a woman who refuses to give up, and that seems like something worth helping." Grace felt heat rise to her face that had nothing to do with the fire or the exertion. Before she could respond, Vincent stood and called everyone back to work. They worked through the night, and Grace lost all sense of time. There was only the rhythm of pick and shovel, the ache in her muscles, the raw burn in her lungs. Sometime before dawn, she stumbled and nearly fell into the trench they had dug. Strong hands caught her, and she found herself steadied against Vincent's solid chest. "Easy," he said, his voice close to her ear. "You need to rest." "I am fine," Grace protested, but even she could hear how weak her voice sounded. "You are dead on your feet. Sit down for an hour." "That is an order, not a request." Grace wanted to argue, but her body betrayed her, swaying despite her determination. Vincent guided her to the wagon and made her sit. He draped a blanket over her shoulders even though the night was warm, then pressed a piece of hardtack into her hands. "Eat. Then close your eyes for a bit. I will wake you when the sun comes up." "What about you? You have not stopped once." "I will rest when the job is done." Vincent's expression softened slightly. "Someone has to keep watch to make sure the others do not hurt themselves. Might as well be me." Grace watched him walk back to the firebreak, his tall form silhouetted against the growing light in the east. She meant to eat the hardtack, meant to only close her eyes for a moment, but exhaustion took her under like a wave. She woke to someone shaking her shoulder and opened her eyes to find the sun already up, the sky hazy with smoke. Vincent was crouching beside the wagon, and Grace noticed with alarm that the fire glow was noticeably closer now, and she could hear a distant roar that made her skin prickle with primal fear. "How long did I sleep?" she asked, sitting up too fast and making her head spin. 3 hours. "We needed you rested." Vincent helped her down from the wagon. "Come look at what we accomplished." Grace followed him to the firebreak and stopped in amazement. What had been a modest trench the night before had transformed into a genuine barrier. The break stretched nearly 200 yards now, a swath of disturbed earth 4 feet deep and 100 feet wide, utterly devoid of anything that could burn. Men were still working frantically at both ends, extending it toward the natural barriers Vincent had identified. "We are almost there," Vincent said. Another few hours and we will have it closed. The question is whether we have enough time." Grace looked at the advancing fire and felt her breath catch. She could see actual flames now, racing through the dry grass and brush on the ridge, consuming everything in their path. The wind had picked up, blowing hot and fierce from the east, and embers were beginning to fall around them like deadly snow. "Everyone keep your heads down and wet your clothes," Vincent ordered, his voice carrying across the break. "If your clothes catch fire, hit the dirt and roll. Do not panic." Grace grabbed a shovel and threw herself back into the work. Her hands were blistered and bleeding, her back one continuous scream of pain, but none of it mattered. The fire was close enough now that she could feel its heat, could hear the crackling roar as it consumed the forest on the ridge. Black smoke rolled over them in choking waves, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. "We are not going to make it," she heard someone say, and realized with shock it was Hector, dependable Hector, who never complained about anything. Vincent was there instantly, his hand on the older man's shoulder. "Yes, we are. Look how far we have come. Look at what we built. 50 more yards and we have it. 50 yards, Hector. You can give me 50 more yards." Something in his voice, in the absolute certainty of it, steadied everyone. They bent back to their work with renewed desperation, racing against the inferno that was bearing down on them like God's own judgment. Grace was hauling rocks when she saw a juniper tree on the ridge explode into flames with a whooshing sound that made her heart jump. The fire had reached the edge of the firebreak. She turned to warn Vincent and saw him standing at the center of the break, staring up at the wall of flame that towered above them, assessing, calculating. "Everyone to the western edge," he called out. "Now, move back but keep working. We finish this." They scrambled to comply, and Grace found herself working shoulder to shoulder with Vincent as they frantically reinforced the last section of the break. The heat was tremendous now, sucking the moisture from her skin, making every breath feel like inhaling fire. Embers rained down around them, and Grace had to pause every few seconds to beat out small fires that started on her clothes or in the dry grass behind them. "That is it," Vincent said suddenly. "We are done. Everyone back to the ranch house. Now." "But we have not finished the south end," Grace protested. "The creek will stop it there. We have done all we can do. Move." They retreated to the ranch, gathering at the house and barn to watch the fire approach their hastily constructed barrier. Grace stood on the porch, her heart hammering so hard she felt dizzy. Everything depended on the next few minutes. Either the firebreak would hold, or everything her family had built would turn to ash. The fire hit the break like an ocean wave hitting a seawall. Flames surged forward, reaching and grasping, but found nothing to consume in the wide strip of bare earth. Grace watched in breathless awe as the inferno simply stopped, thwarted by their desperate labor. Flames licked at the edge of the break, flaring up whenever they found even the smallest bit of fuel, but they could not cross. Vincent stood beside her, as still as stone, his eyes never leaving the fire. Grace realized he was not just watching but actively studying every section of the break, looking for weak points or failures. Beside him, she felt small and safe at the same time, sheltered by his presence even in the midst of catastrophe. The fire burned along the edge of the break for hours, and they all took turns watching it, ready to respond if it found a way across. But Vincent's calculations had been perfect. The break was wide enough, deep enough, and the fire eventually began to lose its fury as it ran out of fuel. By late afternoon, the flames had died down to smoldering embers, and the immediate danger had passed. Grace felt her legs give out and sat down hard on the porch steps. They had done it. Against all odds, they had saved the ranch. Around her, the men were celebrating, clapping each other on the back, laughing with the manic relief of soldiers who had survived a battle. But Grace could not seem to move. She just sat there, staring at the blackened landscape beyond the firebreak, trying to comprehend what they had accomplished. Vincent lowered himself to sit beside her, moving with the stiffness of someone who had pushed his body past its limits. Up close, Grace could see the toll the last 24 hours had taken on him. His face was streaked with soot and sweat, his hands were bloody, and his clothes were torn and burned in several places. But his eyes were bright with satisfaction, the look of a man who had set out to do the impossible and succeeded. "You saved my home," Grace said softly. "I do not know how to thank you." "No thanks needed. You did the work. I just showed you where to dig." Grace shook her head. "Without you, I would have lost everything. We both know that." Vincent looked at her, and Grace felt something electric pass between them, an acknowledgement of the bond forged in shared struggle. "Maybe," he said, "but without you refusing to give up, there would have been nothing to save. Takes courage to stand and fight when running would be easier." They sat in silence for a while, too exhausted for more words, watching the smoke rise from the cooling earth. Eventually, the men from town made their excuses and headed back to check on their own properties. Miguel and Hector disappeared to tend to the cattle and horses, leaving Grace and Vincent alone on the porch. "You should eat something," Vincent said, "and tend to those hands." Grace looked down and was surprised to see her palms were a mess of blisters and torn skin. Strange how she had not felt it during the fight. Now the pain came rushing in, along with every other ache and injury she had ignored. "You are in worse shape than I am. I have had worse." "That does not mean you should ignore it." Grace stood, wincing as her stiff muscles protested. "Come inside. Let me at least clean those burns and wrap your hands properly." Vincent looked like he was going to refuse, then nodded. He followed her into the house, and Grace directed him to sit at the kitchen table while she pumped water into a basin and gathered clean rags and ointment. Her mother had been skilled with healing, and Grace had learned from her before she died. She worked in silence, carefully cleaning the burns on Vincent's forearms where embers had burned through his shirt. His skin was hot under her fingers, his muscles like iron beneath the tan surface. Grace found herself acutely aware of him in a way that made her feel flustered, intensely conscious of the intimacy of touching him, of being close enough to see the darker blue ring around his irises and the small scar above his left eyebrow. "How did you learn to fight fires like that?" she asked, needing to break the silence. "Trial and error, mostly. Spent a lot of years in the mountains, learned what works and what does not. Fire is like anything else in nature. It has patterns, rules. You just have to be willing to observe and learn." "You saved more than my home today," Grace said softly. "You saved my future. This ranch is all I have left of my family." Vincent was quiet as she wrapped his hands with clean bandages. When she finished, he looked up at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "What will you do now?" "The drought is still here. The cattle still need water and grass." It was a practical question, the kind that cut through sentiment to the heart of reality. Grace appreciated that about him, the way he did not coddle her or pretend things were easier than they were. "I will figure it out." "I always do. There is a spring in the north section that has not dried up yet. I can move the herd there, and if I can make it through to fall, the rains should come." "That is a lot of ifs. Life is made of ifs." Grace met his gaze squarely. "But I am still here. The ranch is still here." "That is more than I had any right to hope for this morning." Vincent stood, and Grace realized with a start just how tall he was, how much space he took up in her small kitchen. "I should check the firebreak one more time before dark, make sure nothing has rekindled. Will you stay for supper?" The words were out before Grace could think better of them. "It is not much, but it is the least I can offer after what you did." She saw something shift in Vincent's expression, a wariness that suggested he was not used to hospitality or human connection. But after a moment, he nodded. "I would appreciate that." Grace cooked beans and bacon while Vincent walked the perimeter of the ranch, checking for any remaining danger. By the time he returned, she had set the table and even managed to bake a pan of cornbread. Miguel and Hector joined them, and they ate like starving men, the simple meal tasting better than any feast after the ordeal they had been through. The old ranch hands told stories about Grace's father, about the early days of the ranch, and Vincent listened with the quiet attention of someone who spent more time observing than speaking. But when he did contribute to the conversation, his words were thoughtful and measured, revealing a sharp intelligence beneath the rugged exterior. After the meal, Miguel and Hector excused themselves to the bunkhouse, and Grace found herself alone with Vincent again. The sun had set, leaving the valley in purple twilight, and the air had finally cooled to something approaching comfortable. They sat on the porch, and Grace brought out her father's whiskey, pouring 2 glasses. "To surviving," she said, raising her glass. Vincent touched his glass to hers. "To fighting." The whiskey burned going down, but it was a good burn, warm and bracing. Grace felt some of the tension leave her shoulders, the adrenaline that had kept her going finally draining away to leave a profound weariness. "What is it like?" she asked. "Living alone in the mountains?" Vincent stared out at the darkened valley, his profile sharp against the last light. "Quiet. Simple. You live by the seasons, by what the land provides. No one tells you what to do or judges your choices. But it is lonely too. Sometimes weeks go by where the only voice you hear is your own." "Do you prefer it that way?" He was quiet for a long time. "I used to think I did. After my family died, after everything fell apart, it seemed easier to avoid people altogether. Easier to live without connections, without anything to lose." He turned to look at her, and Grace felt pinned by the weight of his gaze. "But coming down here, working beside other folks, seeing what can be accomplished when people stand together, it makes me wonder if I have been missing something." Grace's heart was beating faster than it should. "What changed your mind?" "Maybe seeing someone who fights for what they believe in, even when the odds are impossible." Vincent's voice was low, intimate. "Maybe meeting someone who makes loneliness seem less appealing than it used to." The air between them felt charged, heavy with possibility. Grace was acutely aware of how close he was sitting, how easy it would be to close the distance between them. But she was also aware of how little she knew him, how he was essentially a stranger who had appeared out of the wilderness at her moment of greatest need. "You are welcome to stay the night," she said carefully. "The bunkhouse has an extra bed. It is too dangerous to ride out in the dark with the burned areas still unstable." Vincent's expression was unreadable. "I appreciate that. I will head out at first light, let you get back to your life." Something in Grace's chest tightened at the thought of him leaving, which was ridiculous. She had known him less than 2 days. But there was something about him, something solid and real that called to a lonely part of her she usually kept locked away. "What if I do not want you to go right away?" The words hung between them, and Grace saw surprise flicker across Vincent's face, quickly followed by something warmer. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that the ranch could use an extra hand, at least until things are more settled. The fire might be stopped, but there is still damage to assess, fences to check, cattle to move." Grace took a breath, pushing past her nervousness. "I am saying that it has been a long time since I met someone I wanted to know better, and I would regret it if you rode out of here tomorrow and I never saw you again." Vincent set down his glass and turned to face her fully. "Grace, I have been living rough for 14 years. I do not know anything about settling down or being part of a community. I would not want to make promises I cannot keep." "I am not asking for promises," Grace said. "I am asking if you would be willing to stay a while and see what happens. No obligations, no expectations. Just two people who might want to know each other better." She could see him wrestling with the decision, could almost feel the war between his instinct to run and something else, something that wanted to stay. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I can stay for a bit, help with the recovery work. But Grace, I need you to understand I am not easy company. I am used to being alone, to doing things my way. That makes two of us." Grace smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "I have been running this ranch alone since my father died. I am not looking for someone to take over or tell me what to do, just someone to work beside. Then we have an understanding." Vincent extended his hand and Grace shook it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. The handshake lasted a moment longer than it needed to, and when they finally let go, Grace felt the loss of contact like a physical thing. They sat on the porch until the stars came out, talking in low voices about everything and nothing. Vincent told her about life in the mountains, about tracking elk and catching trout and surviving winters that would kill a lesser man. Grace told him about her struggles to keep the ranch running, about the prejudice she faced as a woman trying to do a man's work, about the small victories that kept her going. Eventually, exhaustion won, and they said goodnight. Grace lay in her bed, too tired to sleep despite her body's desperate need for rest. Through her window, she could see the bunkhouse where Vincent was presumably doing the same. She thought about his hands on hers as he steadied her at the firebreak, about the way he looked at her like she was strong rather than fragile, capable rather than helpless. She was falling for him. It was too fast, too sudden, but Grace could not deny what she felt. The question was whether he felt the same, or whether she was simply the first woman he had spoken to in months, and the attraction was more convenience than genuine connection. Morning came too soon, bringing with it the harsh reality of the work ahead. Grace rose, dressed in her practical work clothes, and went out to find Vincent already up and checking the firebreak in the early light. The burned area beyond looked like something from a nightmare, a blackened wasteland where vibrant forest had been. But the ranch itself was untouched, green and whole, a testament to their desperate labor. Over the next few days, they fell into a routine. Vincent worked alongside Miguel and Hector to repair damage from wind-blown embers, shore up fences, and move the cattle to better grazing. Grace handled the ranch management, the books and planning, but she also worked beside the men whenever she could. She found herself constantly aware of Vincent, of where he was and what he was doing, drawn to him in ways that both thrilled and frightened her. Vincent was true to his word about being difficult company. He was not much of a talker, often going hours without saying more than a few words. He had his own way of doing things and could be stubborn when he thought his way was better. But he was also unfailingly fair, willing to listen to other perspectives, and he worked harder than any two men combined. Grace watched him gentle a spooked horse with patient skill, saw him fix a broken wagon axle with the same competence he had shown building the firebreak, and felt her respect for him growing alongside the attraction. One evening about a week after the fire, Grace was in the barn checking on a pregnant cow when she heard angry voices outside. She hurried out to find three men on horseback confronting Vincent, who had been repairing the corral fence. She recognized them as hands from the neighboring ranch, owned by a man named Silas Turnbull, who had made it clear he wanted to buy her out. "You are trespassing," Grace said firmly, walking toward them. "I suggest you turn around and leave." The leader, A mean-looking man named Jack barely glanced at her. "We are here on Mr. Turnbull's business. He wants to talk to you about selling, seeing as how you almost let your fire problem become everyone's problem." The fire was stopped. No one's property was damaged except what burned on open range. "Lucky for you this mountain man showed up," Jack said with a sneer. "But luck runs out. Mr. Turnbull thinks it would be better for everyone if this land was in more capable hands, hands that could manage it properly." Grace felt her temper flare. "Tell Mr. Turnbull that my answer is the same as it has always been. This ranch is not for sale." Jack's smile was unpleasant. "Maybe you should think harder about it. Things happen to places that are not properly protected, especially with winter coming on." It was a clear threat, and Vincent moved so fast Grace barely saw it. One moment he was by the fence, the next he was standing beside her, his posture deceptively relaxed but radiating danger. "The lady gave you her answer. Time for you to leave." Jack looked Vincent up and down, clearly trying to decide if he wanted to push the issue. Whatever he saw in the mountain man's eyes made him reconsider. "This is not over," he said to Grace. "Mr. Turnbull does not give up easy." They rode off, and Grace let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "That man has been trying to pressure me to sell since before my father died. He thinks if he makes life difficult enough, I will give up." "Will you?" Vincent asked, watching the riders disappear down the road. "Never." Vincent nodded as if that was the answer he expected. "Then we make sure you are protected. I will ride the property lines at night for a while, make sure no one tries anything stupid. You do not have to do that." "I know I do not have to." Vincent turned to look at her, and Grace felt heat bloom in her chest at the protectiveness in his expression. "I want to. You stood and fought for this place. I will help you keep it." That night after supper, Grace found Vincent preparing to make his rounds of the property. She stopped him at the barn, her hand on his arm. "Vincent, wait, I need to say something." He turned, his face in shadow, lit only by the lantern she carried. "What is it?" Grace took a breath, gathering her courage. "When you first showed up, I thought you were just passing through, that you would help with the fire and then disappear back into the mountains. But you stayed, and every day I find myself hoping you will stay longer. I know it has only been a week. I know that is not nearly enough time to really know someone, but I also know that I have not felt this way about anyone before, and I need you to know that." Vincent was very still, and Grace could not read his expression in the dim light. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "Grace, I have nothing to offer you. No land, no money, no prospects. I am just a man who lives rough and would not know the first thing about being what you need." "What I need," Grace said firmly, "is someone who sees me as an equal, who does not try to control me or change me. Someone strong enough to stand beside me, not in front of me, and in case you have not noticed, that describes you perfectly. I am not good with people. I have spent 14 years avoiding connection for a reason. Then why are you still here? You could have left days ago, but you stayed. Why?" Vincent set down the saddle he had been holding and closed the distance between them. He was so close Grace could feel the heat radiating from him, could see the conflict in his eyes as he struggled with something internal. "Because every time I think about leaving, I cannot make myself do it. Because working beside you feels right in a way nothing has felt right in years. Because when I look at you, I see someone I could stand and fight beside for the rest of my life." Grace's breath caught. "Then stay. Not just for a few more days or weeks. Stay and build something here with me. The ranch needs help and I need you. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you are honest and hard-working and brave. I know you risked your life to save my home without asking for anything in return. I know that when I am with you, I feel stronger rather than weaker." Grace reached up and cupped his face, feeling the rough beard beneath her palm. "I know my heart, Vincent, and right now it is telling me that you are worth taking a chance on." Vincent's control broke. He pulled her against him, and Grace felt the solid strength of his body as his arms wrapped around her. His kiss was fierce and hungry, carrying all the loneliness and longing of 14 years spent in isolation. Grace kissed him back with equal intensity, pouring into it all her own loneliness, her own desperate need for connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Vincent pressed his forehead against hers. "I have forgotten how to do this, how to be with people, how to share a life." "Then we will figure it out together," Grace whispered. "I have forgotten a lot of things too, how to trust, how to let someone in. But I want to remember, Vincent, I want to try." He kissed her again, softer this time, almost reverent. When he pulled back, there was something in his expression that looked like wonder. "I will stay, for as long as you will have me." Joy flooded through Grace, bright and warm and almost painful in its intensity. "Then you had better get used to it, because I am not letting you go." They stood wrapped in each other's arms for a long time, and Grace felt something settle in her chest, a rightness she had not felt since before her father died. This was home, not just the land but this man, this connection. She had been so focused on fighting to keep the physical ranch that she had not realized how much she had been missing the emotional home of genuine partnership. The next few weeks passed in a blur of hard work and growing intimacy. Vincent moved his things from the bunkhouse to the main house, and they navigated the awkwardness of learning to share space with someone new. Grace discovered that Vincent was fastidiously neat, that he woke before dawn no matter what, and that he had a dry sense of humor that surprised her into laughter at unexpected moments. Vincent learned that Grace sang when she cooked, that she had a stubborn streak a mile wide, and that she was fiercely protective of anyone she considered under her care. They worked side by side every day, and slowly the ranch began to recover from the drought and fire damage. Vincent's knowledge of the land proved invaluable. He found a way to divert a tiny spring to create better water access for the cattle. He showed Miguel and Hector more efficient ways to repair fences that would last through harsh winters. He even negotiated a better price for their cattle with the buyers in Lincoln, his quiet intensity making up for his lack of charm. But it was the evenings Grace treasured most. After the work was done and supper was over, they would sit on the porch as the heat of the day faded, talking about everything and nothing. Vincent was slowly opening up, sharing pieces of his past that he had kept locked away. He told her about his family, about his mother who had died giving birth to his youngest sister, about his father who had worked himself to death trying to keep the farm going, about the fire that had taken his 3 siblings and left him with nothing but guilt and grief. Grace shared her own pain, the slow loss of her mother to illness, the sudden death of her father from a heart that just gave out one day while he was mending fence. They traded scars and sorrows, and somehow in the sharing, the weight of them became easier to bear. One night in late September, as the first cool edge of autumn touched the air, Vincent surprised her by pulling her into a dance on the porch. There was no music except the wind in the grass and the distant calling of coyotes, but they moved together anyway, swaying slowly in the darkness. "I love you," Vincent said suddenly, the words rough and unpracticed, like he was speaking a foreign language. "I did not think I would ever say that to anyone again, but it is true. I love you, Grace Whitmore." Grace felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind that came from too much emotion contained in too small a space. "I love you too. I think I have loved you since the moment you told me we could save the ranch, when everyone else said it was impossible." Vincent kissed her deeply, and Grace melted into him, into the solid reality of his body against hers. They stood on the porch holding each other as the stars wheeled overhead, and Grace sent up a silent prayer of thanks for wildfires and mountain men and second chances. In October, Vincent rode into Lincoln and came back with a preacher. They were married on the porch of the ranch house, with Miguel and Hector as witnesses and the valley stretching out green and recovering behind them. Grace wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved all these years, and Vincent wore new clothes that still looked uncomfortable on his mountain-hardened frame. But when they spoke their vows, his voice was steady and sure, and Grace felt her heart nearly burst with the magnitude of what they were promising each other. That night, in the bedroom that had been only hers, Grace gave herself to her husband with complete trust. Vincent was gentle despite his strength, patient despite his obvious desire, and he worshipped her body with a reverence that made her feel cherished in ways she had never imagined. Afterward, lying wrapped in his arms, Grace felt the last pieces of loneliness dissolve, replaced by a bone-deep contentment that this was where she was meant to be, with this man, in this life they were building together. The winter was hard, as winters always were in New Mexico territory, but they faced it together. Vincent's knowledge of survival made the difference between simply enduring and actually thriving. He hunted fresh meat to supplement their stores, trapped furs that brought good money in Lincoln, and spent the long evenings building new furniture for the house, his big hands surprisingly skilled at detailed work. Grace managed the ranch with Vincent's support, making decisions about the herd and planning for the spring. The cattle had made it through the drought lean but alive, and with the fall rains that finally came, the grazing was improving. They were not rich by any means, but they were surviving, and that was enough. In late winter, Grace began to suspect she was pregnant. She waited to be sure, watching her body for signs, and when she was certain, she told Vincent one evening as they sat by the fire. She saw shock cross his face, then something like fear, but beneath it all, a dawning wonder that made him look years younger. "A child," he said softly, as if testing the words. "I never thought I would have that chance again." "Are you happy?" Grace asked, suddenly uncertain. Vincent pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. Happy does not begin to cover it. Terrified, amazed, grateful, all of those, but yes, happy most of all. Their son was born in August of 1882, delivered by a midwife from Lincoln, with Vincent pacing outside until Grace called for him to come meet his child. The baby was healthy and strong, with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined chin. They named him Samuel, after Grace's father, and Vincent held him with such careful tenderness that Grace fell in love with her husband all over again. The ranch prospered slowly but steadily. With Vincent's help, they expanded the herd and improved the land. They built a new barn and reinforced the house against storms. Miguel and Hector stayed on, becoming beloved uncles to young Samuel, teaching him about cattle and horses as he grew from infant to toddler to boy. Vincent never lost his love for the mountains, and sometimes he would take trips into the high country, gone for a week or two at a time. But he always came back, riding down from the ridges with fresh meat and furs, and a lighter expression that told Grace the wilderness still called to him. She never begrudged him these trips, understanding that he needed the wildness to feel whole, just as she needed the ranch and the daily work of building something lasting. In 1885, their daughter was born, a fierce little thing they named Margaret after Grace's mother. She had Vincent's blue eyes and an early indication of his stubborn nature, refusing to be swaddled and demanding to be held constantly. Vincent was besotted, this mountain man who had lived rough for so many years now completely wrapped around the tiny finger of his daughter. The years passed in the way of good years, full of work and love and small everyday triumphs. Samuel grew tall and strong, learning both ranch work from his mother and wilderness skills from his father. Margaret proved to have a gift with horses, gentling even the most skittish animals with patient persistence. They added to the house, built a schoolroom where Grace taught both children to read and cipher, filled the walls with the warm chaos of family life. Grace stood on the porch one evening in the summer of 1890, watching Vincent teach Samuel to track while Margaret practiced her roping on the corral fence. 9 years since the fire had nearly taken everything. 9 years of building and growing and learning to be a family. She thought about that August day when she had stood in this same spot, watching smoke rise over the eastern ridge, certain she was about to lose everything. She thought about the mountain man who had ridden out of nowhere, offering hope when hope seemed foolish. She thought about the desperate hours of digging the firebreak, racing against an inferno, gambling everything on a chance. It had been worth it. Every aching muscle, every blistered hand, every moment of doubt. It had all been worth it to get to this moment, this life, this love. Vincent looked up from tracking practice and caught her watching. His hair was starting to show silver at the temples now, and there were lines around his eyes from squinting against sun and wind, but to Grace, he was just as compelling as he had been that first day. He smiled at her, that rare, full smile that transformed his face, and Grace felt her heart do the familiar skip it always did when he looked at her like that. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat on the porch as they had countless times before. Vincent's arm was around her shoulders, and Grace leaned into his solid warmth, content in a way she had once thought impossible. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "Giving up the mountains to stay here?" Vincent was quiet for a moment, and Grace knew he was actually considering the question rather than just giving her easy reassurance. "Sometimes I miss the solitude," he said honestly. "The simplicity of that life, but regret it? Never. Everything I care about is here. You gave me back what I thought I had lost forever. What is that? A reason to fight, a reason to stay, a home." Vincent turned to kiss her temple. "You gave me a life worth living, Grace. I can never regret that." Grace tilted her face up to kiss him properly, tasting love and contentment and the promise of all the years still ahead of them. "The fire brought you to me," she said softly. "Threatened to take everything and ended up giving me everything instead." "Funny how that works," Vincent agreed. "Sometimes the worst disasters lead to the best outcomes." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one over the valley. In the distance, an owl called, and somewhere closer, one of the horses whinnied softly. The sounds of home, of life continuing in its eternal rhythms. Grace thought about the firebreak, long since softened by grass and time, barely visible now as a slight scar across the landscape. But it was still there, a permanent reminder of what they had accomplished together, of the line they had drawn against destruction and loss. They had stood together against impossible odds and won, and that victory had laid the foundation for everything that came after. As the years continued to pass, the ranch grew into one of the most successful in the valley. Samuel eventually married a girl from Lincoln and brought her home to help run the cattle operation. Margaret married a young veterinarian and settled nearby, close enough to visit often. Grace and Vincent became grandparents, then great-grandparents, the house always full of noise and laughter and the beautiful chaos of family. Vincent's hair went white, but he remained strong, still taking occasional trips into the mountains, though they grew shorter as the years advanced. Grace's hands became gnarled with arthritis, but they remained capable, still managing the ranch accounts and planning for the future. They grew old together, the way they had promised, facing each challenge as partners, their love deepening into something rich and unshakable. On their 30th anniversary, in 1912, their children threw them a celebration at the ranch. Nearly 100 people came from all over the valley, testament to how respected they had become in the community. Grace looked around at the gathering and marveled at how much had grown from those desperate hours fighting the wildfire. Vincent found her standing alone for a moment, watching the festivities, and pulled her into his arms. Despite their age, he was still strong enough to lift her slightly off her feet, making her laugh. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how it all started. About a woman who was about to lose everything and a man who appeared out of the mountains to help her save it. About how a disaster brought me the greatest gift of my life." Vincent set her down gently and cupped her face in his weathered hands. "I appeared out of the mountains," he said, "but you were the one who saved me. You gave me a reason to come down from those peaks and rejoin the world. You showed me that love and connection were worth the risk of loss." Grace kissed him, not caring that their children and grandchildren were watching, not caring that they were old and gray. "We saved each other," she said firmly. "That is what partners do." They danced at their anniversary party, moving slowly to music played on a piano that had been hauled out to the yard for the occasion. Grace rested her head against Vincent's chest and felt his heart beat steady and strong beneath her ear. 30 years since she had stood on the porch watching smoke rise over the ridge. 30 years since a mountain man had offered her hope. 30 years of love and work and building a life together. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. As the sun set over the valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Grace looked at the eastern ridge where the fire had come from all those years ago. The forest had grown back, green and lush, no trace remaining of the devastation. Life had a way of recovering, of healing, of transforming scars into strength. She thought about the young woman she had been, desperate and terrified, fighting to save her home. She thought about the mountain man who had appeared when she needed him most, who had shown her what was possible when two people stood together against impossible odds. She thought about the firebreak they had built, that desperate barrier between destruction and survival, and how it had become the foundation of everything that followed. Vincent squeezed her hand, and Grace squeezed back, their fingers interlocking in the familiar way of long habit. They stood together watching the sunset, surrounded by the family and life they had built, rooted in the land they had fought to protect. The wildfire had threatened the valley. The mountain man had created a firebreak and saved their home. But more than that, he had saved her heart, her future, her hope. And she had saved his, pulling him out of isolation and loneliness into a life full of love and purpose. Together, they had built something that would last long after they were gone, a legacy of courage and partnership, and refusing to surrender in the face of disaster. The ranch would pass to their children and grandchildren, carrying forward the story of how it had nearly been lost, and how two people had stood together to save it. As darkness fell and stars began to emerge, Grace leaned against her husband and felt complete contentment settle over her like a warm blanket. This was what happiness looked like. This was what love built over decades felt like. This was home, not just the land and buildings, but the man beside her and the family around them, and the memories woven into every board and beam. The wildfire had tried to take it all away. Instead, it had brought them together, forged them in heat and smoke and desperate labor into something stronger than either could have been alone. And that, Grace thought as Vincent kissed the top of her head, was the greatest miracle of all.